So this evening, I wanted to talk about one of the great men in history. December the 6th is the anniversary of the death of Dr. Ambedkar. And many people are aware of Gandhi, but not so many people are aware of Ambedkar. And although Gandhi was a great man, Ambedkar was a great man too. And in fact, Gandhi and Ambedkar were actually living at the same time. What I want to say about Ambedkar is that actually Ambedkar is the godfather of the Indian constitution as we know it now. And many people aren't aware that actually the Indian constitution is perhaps one of the most contemporary constitutions in the world in terms of equal rights for women. It's not to say that they actually live by that constitution, but actually Ambedkar was a visionary. In fact, he worked for the Nehru government and he left the Nehru government in disgust because the Nehru government would not give property rights to women. So Ambedkar was a visionary. But the reason why I want to talk about Ambedkar is because Ambedkar was born an untouchable and Gandhi was actually born a merchant. And I'll say a bit more about the caste system later. Ambedkar was born in 1891 and he was born into an untouchable family. And during that time in the 1890s, the English government had an army and they actually had a rank for the untouchables. And Ambedkar's father was in that rank, working for the British government. But the Brahmins were insulted that actually untouchables should be allowed to actually fight for the British Army. And they made so much complaint that the British Army had to disband that untouchable rank. But what they did was to honour those people who had actually been part of the British Army. They agreed to give the people jobs and they agreed to educate their children. And so Ambedkar was actually fortunate because, as I say, his father actually worked in that untouchable rank. So Ambedkar had the opportunity of having an education, which very few, if any, untouchable people would have had that privilege to have an education. There were three critical moments in Ambedkar's life which actually really changed his life. One was when he was a child and when he was at school. When he was at school, during the lunchtime, Ambedkar was made to sit on his own to eat his lunch. He wasn't allowed to eat with the other children and he wasn't allowed to eat because he was an untouchable. And untouchables were considered polluted. So what that meant is that actually even with me sitting here, you see my shadow, if you were sitting in my shadow, you would be so scared to sit in my shadow because you would think I would pollute you. This is what this untouchability meant. It meant that if I, as an untouchable, picked up a cup to drink the water, you, as a caste Hindu, would not pick up my cup because you would be scared that you would be polluted. During the Peshwan times, actually, the untouchable people were made to have brooms behind their back. So as they were walking, they had to pull the broom so that the footsteps were swept away because they were polluting the ground. Some people actually even had to carry a bowl around their neck so that they could spit in the bowl and not on the ground because their spit would pollute the ground. And actually people think, oh, this happened so many hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But I actually interviewed a woman maybe 5 years ago who was in her 80s who actually remembers having her mother having to pull a broom behind her. So, you know, and we don't know what is happening in some of those many villages in India, because there are many villages in India which we don't have access to, and the caste system is still really played out. But coming back to Ambedkar, The fact that he was made to eat his lunch on his own and wasn't allowed to drink from the same water tap actually had an impact on him and actually began to make him think about who he was. Later on in his life, his father was sick, and him and his brother needed to travel to go and see his father. And they travelled in a bullock cart, so a cart which was pulled by bullocks. But the thing is that they had to pass as being Muslim, because if the driver had known that they were untouchable, he would not have given them a lift in that cart. And so basically they passed as Muslim. But at some point in that journey, the driver discovered that they weren't in actual fact Muslim, and they were kicked out of the cart. Another point in Ambedkar's life was, as I said, Ambedkar was fortunate to have an education, and he went on to become one of the most educated men in India of his times. And he actually studied in America, and he studied in Britain, and left those countries with several degrees. And he was able to do that because he had a philanthropist who actually believed in him and actually put money in him to go abroad to study. But the thing was, as we know, there's always strings attached. He had to actually go back and work in a place. So it was like a secondment. He had money to go and study, but it was expected that he would come back and actually work in the city or the town of Baroda. And what actually happened here is when Ambedkar came back to work in that city of Baroda, he needed somewhere to live. And he knew that if he was known as an untouchable, there would be no way that he would actually be allowed to live in any of the inns. And people knew you were untouchable by your last name. So basically he passed as a Parsi, and he managed to get accommodation in an inn, passing as a Parsi. But the thing was that when he went to work, people knew that actually Ambedkar was an untouchable, and people didn't want to work for him. They would throw books at him. They just didn't want to be near him at all. And the word got out that actually this untouchable was working for the council of Baroda. And one day when he was in his inn in the morning, there were actual Parsis who came with sticks banging on his door, ready to beat Ambedkar out of his room. Anyway, Ambedkar managed to escape, and he fled to a nearby park. And he sat in that park, and he began to think. And he realised, if I'm somebody with this amount of education, and I'm being treated like this as an untouchable, what is the rest of my population being treated like, who don't have an education? And that was a critical turning point for Ambedkar, because he realised then at that point he needed to dedicate his life to the uplift of his people. And so Ambedkar realised when he actually made that pact for himself that basically what he needed to do was perhaps work in politics. But he realised even working in politics that wasn't enough. And then he thought, well, maybe law, I'm trained as a lawyer, maybe I will be able to change the law for the untouchable people. And he did manage to bring new laws in, but he actually realised that too wasn't enough. There's a famous conference in the 40s that Ambedkar went to. It was called the Yeola Conference. And at that conference he declared, I was born a Hindu and I will not die a Hindu. And you can imagine what that must have been like in the 40s. Somebody saying, born a Hindu, I won't die a Hindu. But at this point, Ambedkar realised that actually politics wasn't enough. Law wasn't enough to actually create the uplift for his people. And he realised that actually, perhaps it was religion. And he studied every single religion. Well, not every single religion, but he studied many religions. And actually, the religion he came across was Buddhism. And he actually realised that actually, caste, all caste was a state of mind. that caste was a notion of mind. And if caste was a state of mind, if caste was a notion of mind, you needed a religion that would work with the mind. And Ambedkar, through his studies, realised that Buddhism was the religion that would emancipate the mind. And so Ambedkar chose to convert to Buddhism because he knew that that's what his people needed. And then what Ambedkar decided after that, that actually he was going to do a mass conversion of the Maha people, because he was from the Maha caste. And basically he would do a mass conversion of the Maha people. And then his idea would be to go around the whole of India converting the rest of the untouchable people. But sadly, 6 weeks after the first mass conversion in Nagpur on October the 14th in 1956, 6 weeks later he died on December the 6th. And these people were just left not knowing anything about Buddhism. The only thing they knew was to chant the 5 precepts, was to chant, I undertake to abstain from taking life. I undertake to abstain from taking and not given. I undertake to abstain from sexual misconduct. I undertake to abstain from false speech. I undertake to abstain from taking intoxicants. That's all they knew. What were they going to do? And this is where the Triratna Buddhist community actually comes into play, because the founder of the Triratna community, the Venerable Sangharakshita, had actually met Ambedkar. He'd met Ambedkar in the 40s, and Sangharakshita happened to be in India when the mass conversion took place and when Ambedkar died. And he realised that actually he needed to go to Nagpur and actually help with the crisis which had happened. Because Ambedkar had actually thought that with this conversion, that the Buddhist world would actually come to their aid and would actually support this. But the Buddhist world didn't come to the aid of these people, because the Buddhist world actually saw it as a political conversion. They said, this is a political conversion. The only reason why these people have converted is because they want to come out of Hinduism and to become a Buddhist. But Sangharakshita was different. He saw it more than a political conversion. He realised the need, and actually he came and delivered several speeches to the people of Nagpur. And then many years later, actually one of Sangharakshita's disciples actually went to India and actually looked up some of those people who were connected to Ambedkar. And it was through that connection that actually the Triratna founded which was once called the Mahabodha Sangha in India. And what's really interesting is that many people in India see Buddhism synonymous with untouchability. Many people think that actually, if you're a Buddhist in India, you must be from the ex-untouchable caste, which isn't so, because there are many people actually who are Buddhists. But what I would say is that the Buddhists who converted with Ambedkar is almost the 3rd wave of Buddhism in India, because you have the first wave of the Buddha, Shakyamuni, you have the 2nd wave of King Ashoka, and then you have the 3rd wave, who is Ambedkar. But I want to speak a bit more about caste so that we really have an understanding of caste. Ambedkar described caste as a room with 4 floors. He said, you're born on a floor and you die on that floor. And there's no stairway. There's no stairway, that's it. And actually, there's no door into that room either, because actually that door is closed, because the people outside of it are the untouchables. So what you actually have is, on the top floor are the Brahmins, and they are the priests who have the access to the sacred texts. And then on the next floor you have the merchants. And on the next floor you have the warriors. And on the first 3 floors, all of them have had the right to actually hear the sacred texts. But on the bottom floor you had the Shudras, who were born to serve the top 3. And actually, once upon a time, if a Shudra was ever seen to be hearing any of the sacred texts, molten lead would be poured into their ears as a punishment. So, as you can see, the untouchable people weren't even allowed in this room. They were considered too polluted to actually be in that room. They were seen to do the shit work. They were the people who had to clear away the dead animals. They were the people who had to skin the dead animals. They were the people who had to clean away the filth in the streets. And many people think, oh, well, caste, that's something of the past. Caste isn't something of the past. Caste is still really prevalent in India. I'm not saying that things haven't changed, because things have changed. I mean, we actually have Mayavati, who is a leader of one of the biggest political parties in India, who was from the ex-untouchable caste. And we do actually have some ex-untouchable people, many ex-untouchable people who are in government, who are professionals. But the reality is, in the villages, caste is still prevalent. In the villages, you may have Brahmins still living in the village, and on the edge of the village, you will have the ex-untouchable community, who are now called Dalits. And basically, many of those people cannot drink from the same well. So caste is still very much prevalent in India. And, it's something that I feel we, as the rest of the world, need to speak up about. We need to do something about it and actually say what is actually happening. Arundhati Roy actually said a couple of years ago that in India we would see a new revolution. And I really hope that we do see a new revolution, and that actually the caste system does become dismantled.